Hello and welcome YouTube to the Genshin Impact 3.3 tier list. Today I've created a tier list of the power levels of every single Genshin character in the 3.3 meta. There are 64 characters, which includes 29 5 stars and 34 stars, which doesn't really add up. What are you doing, scriptwriter? I have selected to put each character in the tier list based off a few factors. These factors include the damage ceiling in their best teams, consistency of being able to face a large variety of situations and enemies, versatility in team comms, and F2P friendliness. This combination of factors hopefully allows us to think about multiple aspects of each character, including both of their strengths and weaknesses. Additionally, this tier list represents how strongly I would recommend to build a character if you have them on their meta. S being I strongly recommend to build them, and D being I would leave them alone. The tier list just works like any other tier list, consisting of tiers from S to D, S being the best and D being the worst. Additionally, within a tier, the further left a character is, the stronger they are in that tier. So enjoy this video, and if you guys like this video and this is educational to you, please do leave a like and subscribe. Thank you. Here is the tier list. I will explain each tier and each character within each tier, starting from the D tier to the S tier, so we can end without wondering who does and Amber, in order to be as quick as possible. I will only give a few points about each character and why it places them there, and the further up in the tier list tiers we go, the more I will explain about that character. First, we're going to start off with a meta-defining unit, Amber, our favorite outrider. Amber is at the bottom of our tier list and is one of, if not the worst character in this video game. She can't output any competitive damage, and her utility is easily beaten by any character, especially Bennett. However, if you have LG for the end, she can be used as a good pyro applier to vape with Kazuda in a Hu Tao team if you really do need that. Next up, we have the Cryo Kokomi character, our favorite Chi Chi. Chi Chi is just not a very good character in general. Healing is not really needed. She can do very good healing, but if you really want good healing out of her, it takes a decent amount of investment and on-field time from her. And she takes up time that she cannot really give back because of her bad energy generation, and you have to hold sacrificial sword on her, so she herself can't do a lot of damage. So she in general has very bad utility, she has very bad uptime, she requires on-field time, and her damage is overall very cope without giving back much to the team. Next up, we have our favorite Horizons Zero Dawn character, Aloy. Aloy is what happens when whoever try to make Yoimiya a free character. Her gameplay is extremely clunky and very inconsistent, and her damage is just very sad. She can only do single target damage and can still lose to a lot of AoE 4-star characters in a target showdown. The worst part is that she's the only character who does not have constellations, so she is a 4-star character and nobody's gonna get constellations full. The one thing she can be used for is a cryo battery for a Eula team, for example, which is her only decent team, because her own burst damage can be serviceable and her particle generation is also very decent. So that's the one redeeming factor about her. Next up, we have our favorite rock singer, Xin Yan, who is just a mess. Her split scaling between defense and attack is just not useful. On top of that, she's supposed to be a physical damage dealer, but is not electro or cryo, so she can't use superconduct. And she gets a little better at C2, but yeah, it's just not very good in general, because other 4-star DPS characters can easily beat her in a DPS showdown. Then next up, we have our 4-star Chi-Chi, Barbara. She is, as I said, the 4-star version of Chi-Chi. She does very similar, if not the exact same thing as Chi-Chi, except she has better uptime, less field time requirements, and she can hold a TTDS. On top of that, she's decent for Nilo teams as the healer for those teams because you need one, and she's Hydro, and she's also decent in Bloom teams. Next, we have Candace. Her ult is not really useful for any characters because of its bad everything. Its Hydro application is very bad, and she isn't in any team. Maybe she can be used in the future, I don't know. But as for Genshin 3.3, she's just not the best character in the game. Next up, we have our favorite climbing companion, Lisa. She's a pretty useless character, but her A4 passive and being Catalyst user so she can hold TTDS makes her pretty good for Eula teams, probably in Eula's best in slot team. I'll have that playing right now. She is a decent Electro applier, but can't be used in Hyper Bloom teams, and TTDS just makes her a valid character, so it's kind of a dub. Next up, we have our C tier characters, and starting off with the worst of the C tier characters, we have Chong Yun, who can work in some circumstances, especially if you have Shenhe on your account. His Cryo Infusion pretty much doesn't do much, similar to Candace's, and if you're playing him as a DPS, his normal attacks have pretty low scaling, and he also can't freeze because he's a Claymore. But his C2 and A4 give him some more utility, so that's fine, and his burst can quadruple melt, which does increase his damage by a decent amount. Next up in the C tier, we have our favorite house husband, Toma. He can pretty much shield and only shield. He's a decent battery and a decent power applier for Hu Tao in order to shred the res with Viridescent Veneer. He's an okay substitute for Zhongli, but his shielding is partially burst aligned, even though it's a really good shield. But yeah, that's about it. Next up, we have our first Kanrya character, Kaya. He does decent on-field damage and off-field damage. His AoE is not very good, but he can serve as a somewhat viable off-field cryo applicator for melt and freeze teams. And he also generates a decent amount of cryo particles with a low cooldown, but there are better options in terms of cryo damage and particle battery. And yeah, that's about it. Next up, we have Dory, who should probably actually be with Candace in a D tier. I'm not going to really cover anything about her because she can't really do much, but yeah, she should have been in a D tier. I just made this tier list wrong. Next up, we have Yon Fei. Being a 4-star DPS character, she can't really compete with the damage of any 5-star characters, though she can be used as a shielder with TTDS. She can have some stamina problems with charge attack spam, which does get helped with her C1. Her C4 allows you to go for full shield, and it can be better than Toma in some situations. And she can also hold TTDS, which is pretty good. And next up, we have Cole. Her Dendro application and damage can't complete to like DMC or Nahida in any way, but she can be good for subversion teams, and being a Dendro character is a huge plus. Next up, we have the B tier characters. The B tier characters are the actual good characters that can find their place in some meta teams, but they are overall not the best option for those meta teams, and they're not the best in their specific niche. The first character in the B tier is our favorite Razor. Razor, who is an average character who can perform well in a lot of teams, but there are better options. For physical, usually Eula's better, and for aggravate, they usually Kiching or Sino is overall better. He just get outshined by other 5-star DPS characters who can do the same thing as him, it's just better. Next up, we have our favorite overworld taxi, Sayu. Sayu's elemental skill, while being fun, is just not the best. She can't swirl very easily with it, though she can infuse it and find a niche in some Dendro teams. But by virtue of being Anemo and being able to hold Viridescent Veneer, she cannot be a bad character. So yeah, that gives Sayu this spot in the tier list. Next up, we have the Raiden Shogun's footrest, Kujo Sara. Her support capabilities are limited to just boosting attacks, and if you charge and her charge attack mechanic is pretty clunky. She does get a little bit more viable at C2, and if you get her C6, she is like the best character for a Raiden, Kiching, or Sino. But yeah, overall, just a solid B tier for her. Next up, we have the dedicated Geo Doggy, Goro. He's actually a pretty good support for Geo comps, and he's pretty much Geo Bennett in some ways. However, he's B tier because outside that speciality, he's just a useless character. Next up, we have our favorite Goth Nun, Rosaria. She is a viable cryo support due to her decent cryo application and her ability to boost crit rate and physical damage at C6, but she can't output too much damage by herself, and she needs C2 for better uptime, and her application isn't fast enough for a lot of team comps that need fast cryo application. And next up, we have Jean. She can work in a variety of playstyles, such as spamming her ult, spamming swirl, or even being a physical DPS, or she can even be a hybrid. However, there's a better character for each of these playstyles, so she goes in the low B tier. And next up, we have our dedicated Enmo buffer, Faruzan. Like Goro, she's a very niche character, who can only work in DPS animal comps. However, she's higher than Goro because there's 2 DPS animal characters, 3 if you count Heizo. But she is niche and can only be a good support for these 3 characters, or maybe even DPS Kaza if you really want to. Next up, we have our Cryo Shield character, the first one, which is Layla. She's a pretty valid Cryo support who shields and Cryo applicates. The only problem is Diona could do the same while healing, and her tenacity uptime is nothing to scoff at. Next up, we have our favorite Geo mommy, Ningguang. Despite being a 4-star, she can perform pretty well, but she also needs pretty good Geo supports and C6 to be very viable, and she's pretty RNG dependent. But she can perform very well once you get these. One main issue is that she scales with attack and not defense, so she cannot fully utilize Geo Resonance and Goro. And next up, we have our favorite Mondstadt Batman, Diluc. His damage really lacks for a 5-star Pyro DPS when compared to characters like Hu Tao and Yoimiya, but unlike them, he is pretty consistent and can deal decent AoE. The main issue is that he has to compete with Shang Ling, who can literally do as much damage as him off field, which is pretty depressing. So, because of this, his consistency, AoE, and competition places him in the middle of the B tier. Next up, we have our favorite child arsonist, Klee. She can feel really clunky to play and can be very frustrating to play sometimes. Also, like Diluc, there are better pyro options. However, she can do pretty good damage herself, and also like Diluc, the ability to deal AoE damage unlike Hu Tao or Yoimiya is pretty good. The one thing I would like to say about her is that she really gets a massive boost from her constellation, specifically C2, and I feel like she has decent potential in the future because of her ridiculously fast pyro application. Next up, we have our first Electro Mommy, Beidou, because we're going to ignore Sarah. Beidou's skill can feel a bit awkward and weird to use at the beginning, but she also has pretty good burst damage and E damage, but she also has pretty big energy problems, especially because you have to charge up her E. But for the amount of AoE electro damage she can output off-field, she's a pretty valid electro character who goes in the B tier. But I'm pretty sad that she can't work with Raiden. Next up, we have Yunjin. Similarly to Goro and Farzan, she is a dedicated buffer who can buff normal attacks. She is the ultimate normal attack booster, which can work in a variety of team comps such as Yoimiya and Ayato, and some other situations, which makes her pretty valid. And next up, we have the wannabe Knight Noelle. Noelle is a very solid Geo character, and at C6 she can actually be very viable because she also scales up defense, and Goro is a massive buff to her. She is very good at the white blind, and obviously C6. A few problems happen is that she can't generate too many particles with her skill, and she also needs C6 and probably Albedo in order to succeed as a DPS. After Noelle, we have Heizo, who is a generally strong character, but the main problem is that he's a 4-star character. He doesn't provide any utility to the team in any way except for the small EM buff and the swirl that he gives. Though he's probably the best 4-star option as a DPS character, but mostly burst DPS character, he can do a very good amount of damage though, which is nice to see from a 4-star. Next up, we have the 5-star Razor, Sino. Sino is a very good character, but he does suffer from a few problems, one being his long on-field requirements. Similarly to a character like Xiao, his on-field requirement is a little bit too long to sustain himself, and on top of that, his own damage is not very good, and he relies on characters like DMC or the Dendro Traveler, or Nahida, for a majority of his damage. He also has a few energy problems and is burst reliant, but he still can spam his skill during his burst, unlike our favorite animal, Emo Boy. Next up, we have our favorite tsundere, Keqing. Keqing has risen in the meta somewhat with the new release of Dendro, and especially with the release of Nahida, though she still does have a few problems, the most major one being that she is old and she cannot scale off EM like Sino can. That being said, her field time requirements are not as good, and she can swirl VV a lot easier than Sino can, which is why she's a little bit above Sino. And next up, we have our favorite emo boy, Xiao. Like Wanderer, he can be a quite strong animal DPS. However, he can have some energy problems and is very burst defined, and it cannot snapshot any buffs, but it does still require a long field time. So due to the lack of consistency, he goes into the B tier. And next up, we have the newest 5-star DPS on the block, Wanderer. He's a good animal DPS who, if built well, can be a valid DPS. However, his damage output is not as strong as some other DPS characters, so he just goes in the B tier. Next up, we have the A tier. The A tier starts to get pretty solid characters, and characters that can easily clear all the content in the game, and are also pretty top tier characters. First of all, in the A tier, we have Shenhe. Shenhe pretty much only works in cryo comps, but she is one of the best characters in these comps, and she provides a boost stronger than Bennett in these comps, which is pretty rare. And because of this, she's a pretty strong but niche unit in the A tier. Next up, we have Mona. Mona is a decent off-field Hydro character, but she's mainly used for the boost that her burst gives to freeze teams such as Morgana, because of how bad her cryo application with her E is. But yeah, she can also TTDS as well, which is pretty valuable. After Mona, we have Albedo. Albedo is quite the strong Geo sub DPS unit who can do a lot of off-field shield damage and can generate a pretty good amount of shield particles. He's also pretty F2P friendly with the free R5 Sinbar Spindle that we got on the 2.3 event, which I kind of feel bad for people who get that. But for those reasons and the fact that he can work with Hu Tao and Ito, he's a pretty solid character in the A tier. Next up, we have another off-field character, Yaimiko. Yaimiko can do some pretty good off-field electro damage, and now with Dendro, she's a lot better. However, she has some energy issues and is also pretty clunky to use, and Fischl kind of outdoes her in a lot of situations. Next up, we have Nilo. While her damage on her own is not very good, she's quite a strong pair with other Dendro and Hydro characters, where her teams can be one of the best AoE teams in the game, and that's why she is in this tier. Next up, we have another Pyro character, Yoimiya. While she may not be able to do some AoE damage, her burst is quite useless, and her combo can be interrupted. Her single target damage is very high, and using a shield is also very good on her, and she can vape a lot of her attacks with Xingqiu, and all of this gives her a solid spot in the A tier. Next up, we have Tighnari. Tighnari can output a very high amount of burst damage when paired with the right supports, and in general can be a very strong DPS unit. And while usually being confined to single target situations, he can also be used in AoE situations, which is also pretty good. After Tighnari, we have Zhongli. People are going to be kind of pissed when he's this low, but let me explain. While his shielding is the strongest in the game and he can strike resistances, there are other supports who compensate for no shielding, like bigger damage boosts. I personally would prefer having a Kaza or Sucrose on a team over a Zhongli. On top of this, a character like Bennett can provide sustenance and provide a better damage boost by Zhongli, because the only thing Zhongli can really do is provide tenacity and a 20% resistance. That being said, with characters like Yoimiya or characters like Sino, who rely on shields to actually do their full attack string, he can be a pretty good choice, but other than that, he is kind of unnecessary for many accounts. After Zhongli, we're going to have the other Archon, Venti. Venti is valid against enemies that are spread out and can also be used for VVS worlds. However, he stays in the A tier due to his burst lifting up enemies, which can be annoying. And honestly, in terms of strength, he would be in the S tier, but because he can't be used in a lot of teams, because a lot of DPS characters can't properly utilize him, because his burst does lift enemies up, he is in the A tier. Though if it was my choice, not the script writer's choice, I would have put him in the S tier, so just to let you guys know. And now we have the one and only Arataki Ito. Ito is a very strong unit who can deal a lot of damage under the right circumstances. The only problem is it's not easy to get the right circumstances, because he needs a few event exclusive 5-star characters like Zhongli and Albion on his team, and C6 Goro does help him out a lot. But with these characters, Ito can be one of the best DPS characters in the game, so that's why he gets this placement. After the one and only, we have another burst reliant DPS, Eula. Eula can do a very high amount of physical damage, and her burst just deletes single target and multi-target units, and her comms are decently F2P friendly, so she's a pretty valid unit in general. Why is she above Ito, you may ask, and it's just because she is more versatile. There's a lot more enemies with no physical resistance than there are enemies with geo resistance, and honestly their comms do pretty similar damage, so because of this, she is higher than Ito. Next up, we have another 5-star Hydra character, Ayato. Ayato can work in many different team comps and can fulfill a variety of roles. However, when it comes to each specific roles, there's always another character who can beat him in it, but he is decently FTP friendly with everything but his weapons, and he's pretty easy to build as well. And his off-field presence is also pretty decent, which does pump him up a bit. After Ayato, we have another Hydro character, Sangonomiya Kokomi. Despite having no crit, Kokomi can heal a lot while dealing a decent amount of damage and being able to apply Hydro off-field. And she is very useful in a lot of team comps that need a Hydro character. Any Dendro team using Bloom, she is probably one of the best in slot characters for it. The main issue is that she is more of a comfort pick because characters like Ayato and Xingqiu and Yelan do more off-field damage than her. But she is practically required in teams like Virgin and Ayato Hyper Hyper Bloom and Nilo Bloom, because of how much damage you take in these teams. But yeah, overall a comfort pick character, but being Hydro and being that versatile, she gets a spot in the top of the A tier. Next up, we have our other Cryo Shielder, Diona. Diona is probably one of the strongest cryo supports out there due to her ability to create strong shields, and with her C6 giving people a massive EM buff. Her cryo application, her healing, and her ability to somewhat serve as a battery, a very good battery, is very valuable in a cryo team comps. She can also use the algae, which is pretty good as well if you have it. Next up, we have another 5-star Hydro character, Tartaglia, aka Child. His AoE damage is very strong because of his quadruple scaling, and the fact that he's Hydro makes him valid in a variety of team comps, such as Taser and National. However, his skill can be a little tough to manage, but its payoff is very massive. He also has a pretty good Hydro nuke as part of his kit, and Shangling is a broken character in general, which makes Child also a pretty broken character. Next up, our final character in the A tier is Ganyu. The Coco Goat's charge attacks hit like a truck, and she's considered to be one of the best DPS units in the game. However, she's very squishy and sometimes needs a shielder, and if played in Melt, you kinda need Zhongli unless you can instantly kill the enemies. On top of that, she gets kind of outclassed by Ayaka in every scenario, though she's a pretty good on-fielder and off-fielder, and she's also very versatile. Next up, we have the S tier. These are the strongest units in the game that are meta-defining and have been meta-defining since their release for the most part. First up in the S tier, we have our favorite Chunibyo, Facial. With the release of Dendro, Facial got a massive boost in both viability and strength. She is one of the best election units in the game, and she is a staple in many Aggravate and even Bloom comps. Her uptime is almost 100%, and because she's just a 4-star, everybody probably has her. On top of that, her constellations are also pretty good, and she can provide a very good electro battery and off-field particle generation as a 4-star, which is fantastic. This makes her a staple in many Aggravate and even Hyper Bloom teams. Next up in the S tier, we have Sucrose. Sucrose, being an animal character, she can run VV, but on top of that, she can boost a team's elemental mastery, and she can also hold Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer to boost your character's attack. She can boost any elemental damage and any elemental reaction. And with the release of Dendro and EM becoming even more valuable, she became an even better character, which is fantastic. And next up after Sucrose, we have Hu Tao. Hu Tao is considered to be one of the best DPS characters in the game due to her insane single target damage, but she does have a couple flaws with her HP and stamina management without her C1, but if built well, she can probably output the biggest single target DPS of any character, especially because of her quick burst damage with her elemental burst. Next up after Hu Tao, we have Hu Tao's best, or one of her best supports, Xingqiu. Xingqiu is just a very versatile unit. Not only can he apply Hydro extremely well, which can be very helpful for many team comps that need Hydro off field, he can output very high amounts of damage off field and even has damage reduction and interruption and resistance to interruption, resistance, whatever. And he also heals you a bit, even though it's very little. The versatility on top of the fact that he's a very accessible 4-star character just makes him one of the best characters in the game. And next up after Xingqiu, we have the female gender bend Xingqiu, Yelan. Yelan is pretty much Xingqiu with more damage and more buffing, and she doesn't reduce the damage you take, which is a downside, but she does very good damage herself and is a very strong unit, and she's also half of double Hydro. And next up after Yelan, we have Nahida. Nahida easily does the best job of applying Dendro off field, and she can also do very high AoE damage from off field. Her burst also has a very low cost and good energy management, and can have 100% uptime, which easily deserves her a spot in the S tier. And also, she is a staple in any Dendro related team, which is massive. After Nahida, we have Xiangling. Xiangling can do very high pyro damage off field, and her burst has a moderate duration, and can do crazy damage over a duration, especially for a 4-star. Not only this, but she can get a lot stronger with her constellations, notably C3, C4, and C6. Due to this, she is one of the best, if not the best, sub DPS character in the game. Next up after Xiangling, we have Kamisato Ayaka, the better of the two Ayakas, Kamisato siblings. Ayaka is considered to be the best AoE DPS in the game due to her insane shred that her burst can do. At level 10, her burst has a total of 4143% multiplier in 5 seconds. With a well-built Ayaka, this can one-shot most of the world bosses and even some trans domain bosses. She also has a fairly consistent damage without her burst, making her one of the best characters in the game. The third best unit in the game is the Raiden Shogun. She definitely fulfills the role as the Dendro Archon. Her skill already makes her one of the best off-field Electro units for Dendro and Taser comps, and her burst just does so many things at once. Not only does she do pretty decent damage in it, but she also returns energy to her entire team, and can fill it as a spot for rotation when paired with another DPS unit. Because of these reasons, she gets this number 3 placement. Next up, we have Kaedehara Kazuha in the number 2 spot. I don't think this is surprising to many people. I'm sure many people want him at number 1, but I have a good explanation why there's a character better than him. Kazuha is just a strong character with the swirls boost and his own personal damage. Like Sucrose, he can shed resistances with Viridescent Veneer while boosting your own team's damage, but on top of that, he can do a lot of damage himself while grouping enemies. One notable thing is that unlike Sucrose, who only buffs reactions, Kazuha buffs elemental damage itself. Sadly, you cannot swirl things like Geo and Animo, so he can't buff Animo or Geo damage, which is why the character above him is above him. That being said, very good CC, very good damage, and very good buffing. Overall, one of the best characters in the game. Finally, the best character in the game, to everybody's surprise, is our favorite unlucky boy, Bennett. Bennett is the strongest unit in the game. Not only does he heal a ton, but he can also give you a massive attack boost with his burst. On top of that, he is a 4-star, which means you can get him and his constellations relatively easily. His crazy support abilities make him the best unit in the game, and he's used in many team comps. The reason he's above Kazuha is because he can also be used in physical, geo, and animo team comps as their support. And my friends, that is the end of our Genshin Impact 3.3 tier list. If you disagreed with anything in this tier list, please do not hesitate to let us know in the comments down below. If you would like to see some changes in our editing style or in our production quality, please also tell us in the comments below. If you guys enjoyed, please do hit the like and subscribe button because we would greatly appreciate it. And without anything else being said, I'll see you guys the next time.